Welcome back to another chapter in our calm and gentle journey through the quieter corners of history. Here, the stories move slowly, the moments unfold softly, and every detail is chosen to help your mind relax. If you enjoy these boring history videos and they help you rest, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another quiet story. I would also love to know where you are listening from and what time it is right now as you listen. Share it in the comments below. It is always comforting to see how these moments connect us across different places and different hours of the day and night. So, find a comfortable place, let your thoughts slow down, and let us begin tonight's chapter together. In the quiet hours before the full weight of the day settles upon the city, the streets of Victorian London rest beneath a muted gray sky. The air thick with a faint haze that seems to dull the edges of every sound and soften the outlines of the buildings. And as you picture yourself there, imagine walking slowly along a cobbled lane where each stone is worn smooth by countless footsteps that have passed over it through decades of movement. The rhythm of shoes and hooves and wooden cartwheels leaving their faint impressions in the texture of the ground. And here, in this softened light, the buildings rise closely on either side, tall, narrow structures of soot darkened brick, their upper stories leaning ever so slightly toward each other as though they are leaning in to exchange secrets about the centuries they have witnessed. In the windows, small and irregular in shape, hold panes of glass that ripple faintly, distorting the view from the street to the world within, while above them, thin threads of laundry hang loosely, fluttering in the occasional breeze that carries the faint scent of coal smoke mixed with damp stone and the temps of the nearby river. A scent that is at once heavy, yet strangely comforting in its familiarity, and as you walk, the muffled sound of a distant church bell drifts through the haze, not sharp or commanding, but low and lingering, almost as though it has been cushioned by the fog before reaching your ears. And the streets themselves are far from pristine, for a fine layer of dust coats almost every surface, a pale brown-gray powder that rises softly beneath each step and settles again slowly, carried along by subtle drafts between alleyways. And it is this dust, this constant presence in the air, that is as much a part of London as the Thames itself, born of the coal fires burning in countless hearths and stoves, of the grinding of wheels over stone, of the work of countless factories and chimneys that stand like blackened fingers against the skyline. And yet, the people here, those who live their lives entirely within this atmosphere, move about their day with no particular urgency, their pace shaped by the understanding that in this city, time is not rushed, but rather worn down gradually, as the stone is worn beneath their feet. And as you observe the passers-by, you notice their clothes not bright or loud, but in muted tones of brown, gray, and deep navy. Long coats that fall to the knees, skirts that brush against the dust, hats that seem permanently shaped by the damp air, and as they walk, some with small parcels wrapped in paper, others with baskets filled with the simple necessities of the day. Their movements are unhurried, perhaps slowed by the weight of the atmosphere itself, or perhaps simply by the quiet understanding that nothing here is gained by haste, for the city will be much the same tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, its rhythms as dependable as the slow turning of the tide on the river. And when you pause for a moment, you can hear the softer sounds beneath the more obvious noise of the city, the gentle clatter of a milk cart in the distance, the faint scrape of a broom sweeping a shop's threshold, the almost imperceptible rustle of paper as a newspaper boy folds his stack before calling out in a voice that is never quite loud enough to cut through the blanket of haze. And in this slower frame of mind, you begin to notice details that might otherwise be overlooked. The tiny beads of moisture that collect on the iron railings overnight, the way they glistened faintly even in the dim light, the uneven edges of the rooftops where chimneys rise at odd angles, the faint warmth that lingers around the doorways of bakeries where bread is already baking for the day's trade. Its scent mingling with the cold smoke in a way that is oddly harmonious, and, if you were to stand still long enough, you might even feel the faintest vibration through the ground as heavier carts pass somewhere down the lane. Their weight carried through the stones themselves, and all of this, the sounds, the scents, the textures, combine into an atmosphere that is at once muted and rich, not overwhelming in any one aspect, but immersive in its entirety. A slow and steady rhythm of life that seems to move on regardless of the great events recorded in history books. For here, in the everyday streets, history is not something grand or loud, but something that unfolds in small, repeated actions. In a way a shopkeeper arranges his goods, in a way a lamplighter moves from post to post in the fading dusk, in the way a mother smooths the hair of her child before crossing the road. And as you breathe in this air, feeling the faint dryness of the dust as it rests on your tongue, you realize that survival here is not measured by moments of dramatic peril, but by the quiet, constant adaptation to the environment. By the way, people dress to shield themselves from soot. By the way, they learn to read the weather not by the color of the sky, but by the texture of the air. And by the way, they carry on with their daily routines without complaint, accepting the dust is simply part of life. The way the river is part of life, the way the toll of the bells is part of life. And in this acceptance, there is a kind of peace, a quiet resignation that does not feel heavy, but rather grounded, rooted in the knowledge that this is the world as it is. And so, as you continue to walk through the narrow streets, you take in the rhythm of footsteps, the steady movements of people who seem entirely at home in the very conditions that might overwhelm a visitor. You begin to understand that, to truly survive the dusty streets of Victorian London, one must move with them, rather than against them. 2. Let the slow pace and muted tones seep into one's own movements and thoughts. To allow the dust to settle, rather than to constantly try to brush it away. And in doing so, you become part of the city's own slow, unchanging flow. A flow that has carried generations before you and will carry generations after you. Always the same, always just a little different. The dust always returning, no matter how many times it is swept away. The haze always settling again, no matter how clear the air seems for a moment. And in this unending cycle, life continues, quietly, steadily, endlessly. The mornings in Victorian London did not arrive with the sudden clarity of sunlight breaking over a bright landscape, but rather with a slow unfurling, as though the city itself were stretching out from a long and heavy slumber, the air carrying a damp coolness that lingered against the skin and clothing. Not cold enough to bite sharply, but enough to remind you that warmth would need to be earned over the course of the day. And as the dim light began to reveal the outlines of buildings and rooftops through the haze, you could hear the earliest sounds of life starting to stir in the narrow lanes and wider streets. A gentle layering of noises that began so softly that they almost went unnoticed until you realized they had become the soundtrack of the morning. The muffled thud of boots on cobblestones as men walked toward work. The faint creak of wooden shutters being opened from within small rooms. The clinking of metal as a milkman arranged his cans on the back of a cart, and through it all, this ever-present undercurrent of the city's breathing, the faint hiss of steam escaping from unseen pipes. The low hum of distant factories already coming to life, the whisper of the breeze carrying with it the mixed scent of coal smoke, damp stone, and the yeasty warmth of bread baking somewhere unseen. And in these early hours, life seemed to move with a deliberate slowness, as though every movement were cushioned by the weight of the air itself. The dust, not yet fully stirred, but resting lightly on windowsills and railings, ready to rise in gentle clouds once the day's traffic began in earnest, and the people of the city had their ways of meeting the morning, each shaped by the habits of their station and the demands of their work, yet all moving within the same unhurried current, for there was no rushing the Victorian morning, no escaping the gradual build from stillness to the muted hum of full activity. And if you were to follow one of these morning routines in your mind, perhaps you would begin in a modest lodging house where the rooms are small, but the ceilings high enough to hold the lingering warmth from the previous night's fire, where the first light of day enters not in strong beams, but in a soft, diffused glow filtered through glass that is not entirely clear. And here the tenant might rise slowly, pulling on woolen garments that have been hung near the hearth to keep the damp from settling in. The sleeves and hems brushed lightly to shake off the fine layer of soot that seems to cling no matter how often it is cleaned. And after this simple act of dressing, there might come the careful packing of a small bundle or the checking of a pocket watch. Motions done not in haste, but with the quiet repetition of someone who has performed them countless mornings before. If you step outside with this figure, you would find the streets still quiet enough that the sound of your own footsteps seems more present than it will later in the day. Each step sending up the faintest puff of dust that drifts lazily back to the stones. And here you might encounter others beginning their own routines. A baker's boy carrying baskets of warm rolls wrapped in cloth to retain their heat, his path steady as he moves from door to door, or a lamplighter making his return journey after extinguishing the last of the street lamps, his pole resting lightly against his shoulder, his coat hem catching at the occasional loose stone. And perhaps you would pass a woman sweeping the narrow area before her shop, each stroke of the broom deliberate, the soft scrape of bristles against stone blending with the other subdued noises of the street. And even those who had little reason to be abroad in the early hours might be seen leaning from doorways or windows, quietly observing the street as though gauging what the day might bring, though the truth is that most days brought more of the same gradual brightening of the sky, the same mix of scents in the air, the same familiar faces passing on their way to tasks that have been theirs for years. And yet within this sameness there was a certain comfort, for the city's predictability was itself a form of stability, a way of life that could be counted upon to continue, and the routines reflected this, from the chimney sweep preparing his brushes and rods, to the costermonger setting out his barrow of goods, to the school children walking in small groups, their chatter subdued in the still, heavy morning air. And as the hour progressed, more windows opened, more doors creaked on their hinges, the streets filling gradually, but never suddenly, as though London preferred to slip into the day rather than leap into it. And always the haze seemed to remain, a soft veil over everything, muting the sunlight, blurring the edges of buildings so that they seemed to fade slightly into the air itself. And this haze was as much a part of the morning as the toll of the church bells marking the hour, or the faint sound of hooves on the cobbles, or the occasional call of a street seller announcing their wares in a voice shaped by years of repetition. And the people moved through it all without apparent notice, their breathing adjusted to the air, their eyes accustomed to the muted light, their clothing bearing the marks of a city where dust and soot were constants rather than intrusions. And as you walk with them in your mind, you begin to see how these routines were not merely habits, but small acts of survival, ways of preserving one's health, one's livelihood, and one's place within the slow but unending rhythm of the city. For in Victorian London, the day did not begin with grand declarations or sudden transformations, but with these quiet acts, performed in the midst of dust and haze, repeated so many times that they became as natural as breathing. And in that repetition there was a kind of resilience, a quiet endurance that asked for no praise and sought no recognition. For survival here was not about overcoming extraordinary events, but about continuing through the ordinary ones, day after day, year after year, until the motions themselves became the measure of life. And so the morning routines went on, the small tasks done with care, the streets gradually waking, the haze slowly lifting but never disappearing entirely, and the people, moving always at the city's own pace, carried themselves forward into whatever the day might hold, not with excitement or dread, but with the calm acceptance that in this place each day begins and ends in much the same way, and it is in that sameness, in that quiet persistence, that life on the dusty streets of Victorian London truly resides. The markets of Victorian London did not announce themselves with sudden bursts of noise or color in the early hours, but instead unfolded gradually like a slow breath drawn into the city's lungs, each stall and cart appearing one by one until the streets that had been quiet and muted at dawn were filled with a steady hum of activity. And yet this activity, despite its scale, was not hurried in the way a modern market might be. For in this time, the pace of commerce was shaped by the weight of goods carried by hand or cart, by the limitations of the human voice calling out wares, and by the simple fact that most people moved through the streets on foot, weaving slowly through the narrow lanes where stalls were set up in long, uneven rows, their awnings sagging slightly under the weight of moisture in the air, the fabric stained from years of coal smoke and dust settling on it day after day, and as you walked among them, the sounds around you would blend into a layered tapestry of voices and movements, the low murmur of customers asking after prices, the sharper tones of sellers describing their goods, the occasional clink of coins changing hands, and beneath it all the slow, rhythmic creak of cartwheels turning over uneven stones, their wooden rims occasionally catching at a ridge and sending a faint shiver through the handles held by the seller. And the goods themselves were as varied as the people who passed between them, with baskets of root vegetables still holding clumps of earth from the fields, the dirt falling in soft little showers whenever they were moved, and barrels filled with apples, whose skins bore the dull sheen of having been handled many times, and the smell of fresh bread mingling with the sharper, saltier scent of fish laid out on slabs of wood, their silver scales catching what little light filtered through the haze above. And further along the market street you might find bolts of fabric stacked neatly, the colors muted not only by their natural dyes, but by the film of soot that clung lightly to everything, the merchant occasionally brushing at them with a cloth, though never truly able to remove it entirely. And in the slow movement of the crowd, you could see the market's true rhythm, for unlike the rushed exchanges of later times, here each purchase was a small negotiation, a brief conversation, or even just a shared look between buyer and seller that conveyed the understanding of long acquaintance. And these moments happened in their own time, unaffected by any sense of urgency, as if everyone accepted that the market would go on until it was meant to end, no sooner and no later. And so the flow of people continued, winding through the narrow passages between stalls, stopping to inspect a basket of onions or to lift a small jar of preserves to the light. Their steps unhurried, their speech softened by the thick air, and as you stood among them, you would feel the market as much as you would hear or see it. The subtle warmth of bodies gathered close together against the dampness, the occasional brush of a sleeve as someone passed, the faint vibration of cart, wheels moving nearby, and above it all, the haze of the city hanging like a low ceiling, filtering the light into something gentle and diffuse, so that even the brightest colors in the market appeared softened and worn. And perhaps that was part of its quiet charm, for nothing here was sharp or glaring. Everything was touched by the same gentle patina of age and atmosphere. And survival in such a place was not simply about the buying and selling of goods, but about being part of this slow current, about knowing where to stand so as not to block the path of the fishmonger as he carried his tray. It's about understanding the right moment to step forward to make a purchase, about exchanging not only coins, but small courtesies, for in a city where the air itself seemed to weigh on every movement, There was little room for impatience, and so the market moved, as it always had, at the pace of hands setting out produce, of voices raised just enough to be heard without straining, of footsteps shifting from stall to stall, and through it all, the dust remained drifting in faint motes that caught the light when the sun managed to break through for a moment, settling again on baskets, on coats, on the brim of a hat, and being brushed away with a movement so casual it seemed unconscious. For here the dust was as constant as the sound of a vendor's voice or the creak of a cart, and in this constancy there was a strange sense of belonging. For the market was not only a place of trade, but a meeting point, a place where familiar faces were seen week after week, where news was exchanged in quiet tones, where the passing of time was marked not by the turning of a clock, but by the shifting produce of the season, the heavier coats of winter giving way to lighter fabrics in summer, though even then the haze and the dust remained unchanging companions to the life of the city. And as you walked to the end of the market street, where the stalls began to thin and the sound of voices became more distant, you might look back and see it all as a single living thing, a gentle tide of people and goods flowing through the narrow space between the tall, soot-darkened buildings, the slow movements of the sellers arranging and rearranging their wares, the customers leaning in to inspect a loaf of bread or to test the weight of a cabbage in their hands, the quiet exchanges that formed the real heart of the market. And you would understand that this was not just a place to buy food or cloth or tools, but a place where the city's slow pulse could be felt most clearly, where life went on much as it always had, untouched by the grand events that might fill the pages of history. And in that slow continuity, there was a kind of endurance, the endurance of people who had learned not to fight the pace of the city, but to move with it, carrying their baskets, making their bargains, brushing the dust from their sleeves, and returning again the next day or the next week to do it all over again. Each repetition another thread in the long, unbroken fabric of life on the dusty streets of Victorian London. The streets of Victorian London were never truly silent, and even in the earliest hours of the morning or the last fading light of evening, there was always the steady, rhythmic presence of hooves and wheels moving across the cobblestones, a sound that did not burst into being, but rather flowed on without beginning or end, as if the city itself were breathing in long, measured cycles. And as you listened, standing at the edge of a narrow street or leaning lightly against the dark iron railings of a corner building, the pattern of the noise would begin to reveal itself, the soft, muted clop of hooves striking the stone, followed by the faint creak of wooden wheels turning over the uneven surface, the two sounds blending into a constant background hum that could lull the mind into a kind of waking dream if you let it. For these were not the harsh, metallic screeches of later ages, but rather the organic, almost living sounds of horse and wood and stone, worn together over countless hours of use. And each passing cart carried its own distinct rhythm, some slow and deliberate, the driver allowing the horse to take its time, the wheels rolling heavily as though each turn required a moment to consider, others moving with a brisker cadence, though never fast enough to break the unhurried pace of the street itself. In between these, there might be the lighter, quicker steps of a single rider on horseback, the hoofs striking with a sharper tone, but still softened by the air thick with dust and smoke, and all of it together created an unbroken music, a kind of heartbeat for the city, steady enough that the mind soon stopped treating it as noise at all, instead folding it into the very sense of being in London, so that if it were suddenly gone, the silence would feel unnatural, almost unsettling, and the sound was not simply in the ears, but in the body, too. For, if you stood close enough to the passing traffic, you could feel the faint tremor through the stones beneath your feet, each wheel and hoof sending its subtle vibration into the ground, carrying the weight of goods, of people, of the day's work from one place to another. And in this way, the endless passage of hooves and wheels was more than a sound. It was a constant reminder of the city's slow but steady motion, the visible proof that life was being carried on in every direction at once. And if you followed one cart in your mind's eye, perhaps a delivery wagon carrying sacks of flour from a riverside warehouse to a bakery in another part of the city, you would notice the small swirls of dust rising in its wake, the way the horse's breath steamed faintly in the cool air, the way the driver shifted occasionally in his seat, adjusting the reins with practiced ease, his coat collar turned up against the dampness, and behind him the street would close again as other carts took their turn, each adding its own layer to. The steady rhythm and the sound was not confined to the busier thoroughfares, for even in the narrow lanes between tightly packed rows of buildings, a lone cart might make its slow way, the hooves striking a little more sharply in the confined space, the wheels echoing faintly against the walls, and in those moments, the sound seemed to linger long after the cart had passed, as though the air itself held on to it for a few extra seconds before letting it fade. And this was the nature of the streets, that the movement was constant, yet never overwhelming, that the rhythm could fill a whole day without once rising into urgency, that the sound of hooves and wheels became as natural as the tolling of the church bell or the distant hiss of steam from the rail lines, and it shaped the way people moved and thought. For one learned to step aside without hurry, to let a cart pass, and then resume one's own pace, to listen for the approach, not so much with the ears as with the whole body, and to cross the street only when the space between wagons was wide enough to stroll rather than to dash, for in a city like this, nothing was ever gained by rushing, And so the wheels turned and the hooves struck the stones, day after day, season after season, through rain that made the stones glisten and the sound deepened into a hollow, almost musical resonance, through dry days when the dust rose and softened every note into something gentler, through fog that swallowed the edges of the sound so completely that it seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the people moved with it, accepting its constancy, knowing that this unending sound was as much a part of London's character as the river's slow current or the faint smell of coal in the air. Perhaps it was this very constancy that made the sound so strangely comforting, for in a world where fortunes could rise and fall, where buildings could change purpose or disappear entirely, where the faces in the street might be familiar one day and gone the next, the hooves and wheels remained, their rhythm a promise that life, in all its slow persistence, would carry on. And if you were to stand at a busy crossroads and simply close your eyes, letting the other sounds of the city drift into the background, you could imagine the passing of time marked not by clocks, but by this endless rolling and striking, each moment blending seamlessly into the next until hours passed unnoticed. And when at last you opened your eyes, the scene before you would be much the same as when you began, the same dust settling in the air, the same carts trundling past, the same measured pace of horses lifting one hoof and then the next, as though the city itself had been holding its breath in a long, steady exhalation, never hurried, never stopping, simply moving forward in the way it always had and always would. The unchanging, quiet motion of life on the dusty streets of Victorian London. The River Thames in Victorian London did not rush with the force of a mountain stream or roar with the sound of waves, but instead moved with the slow, deliberate current of something that had been part of the city's life for as long as the city itself had stood, its broad surface carrying both the memory of centuries past and the weight of each day's quiet labor. And if you were to stand on one of its many bridges in the early hours before the full day's activity had reached its height, you would see the water lying under a pale, hazy sky, the surface not flat like glass, but rippling gently, the movements small and steady, shaped as much by the tide as by the passing of boats. And the air here was different from the air in the tightly packed streets, for it carried the faint temps of the river, a scent of damp wood, of silt, of water that had touched both farmland and factories before reaching this stretch between the city's banks. And it mingled with the ever-present trace of coal smoke drifting down from chimneys, creating a blend that was uniquely London's. And as you leaned on the cool stone of the bridge's balustrade, you could watch the slow progression of barges and small steamers making their way along the water, some piled high with goods from a river, others low in the water from the weight of coal or timber, their movements unhurried, guided not by the rush of schedules, but by the steady necessity of moving one load from one place to another, and each vessel carried its own set of sounds that blended into the river's constant murmur, the gentle slap of water against a hull, the creak of ropes under strain, the soft call of a boatman to another as they passed. Their voices carrying more clearly here over the open water than they ever could through the crowded streets, and even the smallest craft seemed to take its time, the oars dipping and lifting in a slow rhythm, the ripples they made spreading outward until they disappeared into the wider current. And on the banks there was movement too, though it was less deliberate, men unloading crates onto the worn timbers of the wharves, their boots leaving faint, damp marks on the planks, the sound of their work a muffled counterpoint to the softer noises of the river. And here survival took its form, not in grand gestures, but in this steady, dependable motion. For the river was more than just a body of water. It was a working road through the city, a slow artery carrying the materials that kept life moving in every quarter. And the people who worked along it knew its moods and patterns, as well as others knew the streets, able to read the tides turning by the shift in the current, to sense the change in the wind before the ripples altered, to judge how best to guide a vessel into place without wasting effort. And these skills, passed from one generation to the next, were as much a part of life here as the rope in a boatman's hand or the blackened timbers of the docks themselves. And if you walked along the river's edge, you would find moments of stillness between the movements, places where the water lapped quietly against Moscovite steps leading down to the tide, where the reflection of a warehouse window trembled on the surface before breaking into fragments with the passing of a wave. And in these moments, the river seemed to hold its breath, though only for an instant, for another boat would appear, soon enough, adding its slow weight to the water's endless procession. And you could follow this procession in either direction, imagining the goods and people it carried, the barrels of flour making their way toward a bakery, the stacks of cloth bound for a tailor shop, the coal heading toward the countless stoves and grates that warmed the city's rooms, and even the less pleasant cargoes, the refuse carried away to be disposed of elsewhere, the materials, too worn or broken to be of further use, all moving at the same measured pace. For the river's flow did not distinguish between what it carried, only that it kept moving, as it had for centuries, and the people who depended on it did the same. Their days shaped by the tide's rise and fall, their work beginning and ending, not by the clock, but by the state of the water. And in this way, the Thames set its own rhythm for a portion of the city's life, a rhythm that could be felt even in the streets far from its banks, for the goods unloaded here would pass through the markets, be carried on the carts whose wheels you could hear in the distance, be worn, eaten, burned, or used in the countless small ways that sustained the city. As always, quietly, the river would continue, its surface reflecting the changing light of the day, from the dim silver gray of morning through the muted gold of afternoon to the deep, shadowed tone of evening, when the lamps along the embankment began to glow, and their reflections trembled in the rippling water. And even then, in the dark, the river would not rest. 4 boats still moved along it, their lanterns casting small circles of light ahead, the sound of their passage carrying across the water in the cool night air, the slow slap of the current, against their holes, as steady as a heartbeat, and in this unbroken motion, you could sense the deeper truth of the Thames, that it was not only part of the city, but in many ways the city's foundation, a constant presence that had shaped where people lived, how they worked, and how they moved for generations, and to stand beside it, whether in the bright light of day or the softened shadows of dusk, was to stand beside the slow, enduring pulse of London itself, a pulse that, like the rhythm of hooves and wheels in the streets above, will continue long after the faces and buildings of the present had changed, carrying forward the quiet persistence of life on the dusty streets of Victorian London. There were days in Victorian London when the air itself seemed to hold its breath, when the familiar din of carts and footfalls and the distant cries of vendors softened beneath the thick, unmoving pall that blurred the edges of sight and sound. And on such days, the dusty streets were not merely thoroughfares for travel, but narrow corridors through a world half-formed, the outlines of buildings smudged into the haze so that they appeared less as solid structures than as shadows, tall and still and watchful, their soot-darkened bricks weeping faint streaks of black where damp had gathered, and the ground underfoot, though cobbled and uneven, seemed muted beneath a thin layer of grime that had been trodden into it by years of boots and hooves, the dust rising in slow, lazy spirals with each passing step, only to drift back down without ever quite settling, a perpetual dance that hinted at the city's constant churn. And yet, for all its movement, there was a strange quiet to these moments, the kind of quiet that does not come from an absence of sound, but from its soft reshaping, so that even the steady clip-clop of a horse's hooves became a dull, padded rhythm, as though striking not stone, but the thick fabric of some great, invisible curtain drawn across the city. And if one walked far enough down such a street, past the crooked shop fronts with their dusty windows and hand-painted signs dulled by soot, past the iron railings slick with a film of damp grit, one might begin to notice the way the smells of the city also altered in such weather. The sharp tang of coal smoke and the heavier, bitter scent of tar softening into a uniform, weighty musk, neither pleasant nor wholly unpleasant, but familiar in the way that the smell of an old, long-worn coat is familiar, carrying the memory of countless days in the open air. And mingled with this was the faint sweetness of something roasting, perhaps chestnuts, or bread turning golden in the small brick oven of a bakery tucked deep into an alley at scent, reaching out tentatively as if uncertain whether it could pierce the gray veil. And all the while, the people moved within this softened world, their outlines no more distinct than the buildings, their coats and hats rendered as muted shapes, their steps slow not from weariness, but from the way the haze seemed to persuade the body to move at its own unhurried pace. And in their stillness, or near stillness, one could see the small details that, on clearer, busier days, were lost to the rush of the streets, the slow turning of a gloved hand as it adjusted the brim of a hat against the settling soot, the slight tilt of a head as two figures leaned closer to speak in voices pitched low enough to remain private, the way a child's boot scraped along the stones as it trailed behind his parent's longer stride, drawing out a faint, deliberate rhythm. And even the street vendors, those tireless heralds of wares and bargains, seemed subdued, their calls rolling gently into the mist rather than slicing sharply through the air, so that a seller of ribbons and cloth might seem less a merchant than a figure in a dream, its words blending with the sounds of wheels creaking over stone and the faint, metallic ring of a hammer somewhere far off, striking a surface in slow, steady intervals. And in this softened light and softened sound, the city's harder edges blurred, the soot and grime becoming not marks of neglect, but part of a single, muted palette, as if London itself had been painted over in shades of ash and cream and pale gold, the glimmer of which came only from the occasional flare of a gas lamp, its flame swaying behind its glass enclosure. casting a trembling halo on the surrounding haze, and it was in these moments when the city moved as if in half-sleep. That survival here revealed a gentler side, for it was not always about enduring the noise, the press of bodies, the bite of cold wind along the Thames, but also about learning to move within this quieter rhythm, to breathe in the softened air without longing for the clear and sharp, to let the gray veil settle over the senses until it became almost comforting, a reminder that not every day in London was a battle against its harsher truths, that sometimes the soot could be less a burden than a blanket, and so the people, wrapped in their own muted colors, walked the dusty streets as though through a living memory, their shapes and sounds part of a city that knew how to be both unyielding and tender, and in the slow, deliberate pace of these days, one could sense a continuity, as if the street beneath one's feet was not only the present moment, but also the echo of countless days just like it, stretching back through decades of the same slow hoofbeats, the same muted voices, the same curling smoke, a rhythm so steady that it seemed it could carry on forever, unbroken even by time itself. In Victorian London, there were many trades that thrived on the ceaseless life of the streets, each one as much a part of the city's rhythm as the slow turning of the Thames or the regular tolling of the church bells. And among them was the humble water seller, a figure often overlooked in the busy tapestry of urban life, yet one whose quiet persistence carried its own story of survival. For in an age before every household could count on clean water flowing from a tap, before the great sanitary reforms and underground pipes that would one day change the city's habits, men and women alike could be seen pushing or pulling small handcarts or carrying yokes across their shoulders from which hung large wooden pails, the surface of the water inside trembling gently with each step. And these sellers would walk the length and breadth of the streets, from the crowded courts of Whitechapel to the quieter, broader avenues near Bloomsbury, their paths determined less by personal preference than by the subtle geography of need. For certain corners were known to be better for trade than others, perhaps near a busy market or outside the gates of a factory where the workers, tisty and parched, would pause to purchase a ladle of water for a penny, or, on hot days though, rare in the London climate, by the entrance to a park where families lingered in the shade of trees, whose leaves were dulled by the soot that drifted even here. And it was not unusual to see a seller pause for a moment, leaning slightly to one side to ease the strain on their shoulders, their eyes scanning the street not hurriedly, but with the slow, practiced attention of someone who knows that their work is not about speed, but about endurance, about being present at the right moment when thirst made itself felt. And though the work could seem monotonous, walking the same streets day after day, calling out the same short phrases to announce one's where Sid required a quiet kind of skill, for the streets themselves were always shifting, not in their layout, but in their moods, in the flow of their traffic, in the way a sudden shower might send people hurrying under the nearest awning, or a patch of bright sunshine might draw them out again. And the water seller learned to read these changes the way a sailor reads the wind, adjusting their pace, their route, their stance, sometimes lingering in one place for an hour, sometimes drifting steadily onward without pause. And in between these small decisions was the constant physical act of carrying the water itself, which, though it might seem a simple matter, was a weight that wore down the body over time, pressing into the shoulders, stiffening the back, making each day a test of strength and balance. And yet there was a rhythm to it, a slow sway as one walked, the sound of water sloshing softly against the sides of the pail, a sound that could become almost meditative, especially when paired with the other small sounds of the street, the muffled wheels of a cart on the cobblestones, the distant murmur of conversation, the faint metallic ring of a boot heel striking a loose stone, and, if one paid close enough attention, one could almost feel the city breathing around these cellars, their steady paths like threads weaving through the larger fabric of London life, connecting one neighborhood to the next, carrying not only water, but a sense of quiet reliability. For the sight of a water cellar was a familiar one, a reassurance that even in the dustiest, driest corners of the city, refreshment could still be found. And so their role was not merely practical, but also symbolic. A small reminder of continuity in a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. And in the evenings, when the day's work was nearly done and the pails were lighter, the sellers would make their way home along streets where the gas lamps had begun to glow faintly in the gathering dusk, their yellow light bending in the rippling surface of the water that remained, the cool air carrying the faint smell of damp stone and the heavier scent of coal smoke as hearths were lit for the night. And perhaps a seller would pause to look back along the street they had just walked, noting the way the lamplight softened the outlines of the buildings, the way the dust that had hung in the air all day now settled into the cracks between the cobbles, ready to be stirred up again by the first footsteps of morning. And in that moment there might be a quiet satisfaction, not the triumph of a great profit or a bold achievement, but the simple, enduring knowledge that they had been part of the day's life, that their small, steady service had kept the city moving in its own subtle way. For even in a place as vast and restless as London, survival was often built not on grand gestures, but on the repetition of modest acts performed with care, day after day, until they became as much a part of the streets as the stones themselves. And as the seller finally turned toward home, their steps perhaps a little lighter now, the slosh of the water in the pail softer, the sounds of the street dimming behind them, they disappeared into the same intricate web of alleys and lanes from which they had emerged that morning, leaving only the faint trace of their passing, a memory carried in the sound of water, in the slow rhythm of their walk, a thread that would be picked up again with the next day's dawn, binding once more the many corners of the city with the quiet, steady work of survival, as the last pale wash of daylight faded over the rooftops of Victorian London, giving way to a quiet, bluish dusk. There came a figure who moved with an almost ceremonial slowness through the lengthening shadows, a figure whose work was both ordinary and strangely poetic, the lantern lighter, a man whose task it was to bring gentle light into the gathering dark, one lamp at a time, pacing along the uneven cobblestones with a long, slender pole carried upright at his side, its brass tip glinting faintly even in the dimness, and in those calm hours between the closing of shop shutters and the full arrival of night. His steady progress was a small reassurance to those who lived and worked along his route, for the flicker of gaslight at the end of a street meant that the familiar pattern of the evening was unfolding as it always had, unhurried and unbroken, just as it had the night before, and just as it would the night after. And with each measured step, the lantern lighter seemed to bring with him a stillness that softened the edges of the day's noise, his boots tapping lightly against the stone in a rhythm that matched the deliberate raising and lowering of the pole as he paused beneath each tall iron post, adjusted the glass-framed case, and coaxed the small, waiting mantle to life with a bloom of faintly golden light that pushed back the shadows in a soft, imperfect circle. And then he would move on, the pole swinging slightly at his side, his form merging with the dimness ahead until the next stop brought him into the quiet spotlight of another lamp. The act repeated over and over, each instance, a small, almost invisible act of service, yet together they transformed the city from a place of dark uncertainty into one threaded with lines and pools of light. And though the grand boulevards benefited from the brighter, better maintained lamps, the lighter's route also took him into narrower lanes where the smell of damp brick and coal smoke hung low in the air, where washing still fluttered faintly between buildings on ropes strung high overhead, and where the worn faces of tenements looked down with an air of tired familiarity upon the work, for these smaller, less cared-for streets depended on his visits more than the central squares did. And there was a kind of quiet dignity in this impartial service. In lighting a lamp for the wealthy merchant and for the dock laborer with the same deliberate care, and in doing so without flourish or the need for recognition. And perhaps it was in this constancy that the lantern lighter's value was truly felt, not in any single lamp, but in the steady repetition of the act. The comfort of knowing that every evening, without fail, the same warm light would be there to meet you on your walk home, casting its soft glow on the paving stones, glinting off the wet curve of a wheel rim, catching in the brass buttons of a constable's coat, and in the quiet gaps between these moments, the lighter himself observed the small, shifting details of the streets he knew so well. The change in the scent of the air after a light rain, the appearance of a new poster pasted to a wall overnight, the slightly heavier footsteps of someone hurrying home before the lamps were fully lit, all of which became part of the unspoken record of his rounds, a record that belonged to no one else and would be spoken of to no one, Osita, for his work was not the kind that invited conversation, but rather the kind that was understood without words. And on nights when a fog crept in from the river, the act of lighting the lamps became even more necessary, their golden halos reduced to small, floating orbs in the thick air, the glow diffused and blurred, so that the line of posts seemed to vanish just a few paces ahead. Yet still he moved forward, striking the small flame, adjusting the valve, stepping back to watch as the mantle flared and settled into its steady glow, then vanishing again into the mist. And perhaps, though he might not admit it, there was a quiet pride in seeing the whole length of a street transformed behind him, the darkness broken at regular intervals, each lamp standing like a sentinel against the night, their light overlapping just enough to guide a careful step, but never so bright as to erase the gentle mystery of the hour, when his work finally brought him back toward the place where he had begun. The lighter could turn and take in the full sweep of his labor. Oh, the lamps stretching away into the distance, marking the curve of a road, the rise of a hill, the slow bend of a bridge over the water, all now softened under their shared glow. And though he would likely never be named in the city's histories, though his life and his route would pass quietly into memory, his work lived on in the rhythm of the streets themselves, in the way that people stepped a little more lightly when they walked through the gaslit pools, in the way that the city seemed a fraction smaller, more knowable, and more human once the lamps were lit. And so, each night, without hurry, without the need for applause, he performed his task until the last lamp was burning, leaving behind a trail of warmth stitched into the cool fabric of the dark, pattern that would remain until the first pale light of dawn arrived to make his work invisible again, though the comfort of it would linger unspoken in the minds of those who had passed through its glow, in the soft, nearly soundless hours before the first signs of dawn began to touch the edges of the city, long before the chimneys woke to their slow exhalations of coal, smoke, and long before the clatter of carts began echoing along the stone-paved streets. There was already a quiet figure at work in a dimly lit shop on one of the narrower lanes of Victorian London, a shop whose shutters were still drawn against the sleeping world outside, though from within there came a faint, warm glow and the gentlest scent of yeast that drifted out through the thin cracks in the door, carrying with it the promise of fresh bread. And this was the baker, a man who lived and worked according to the clock of his craft rather than the hours of the city, a clock that rang its silent chimes in the deep night when most windows were dark and the cobbles outside gleamed faintly under the cold light of the moon. And within the snug confines of his bakehouse he moved with an unhurried precision, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his forearms dusted with flower-like pale gloves, the rhythm of his movements shaped by years of repetition until each gesture was part of a quiet dance between him and the dough. For bread in this age was not the quick, machine-kneaded thing it would become in the decades to follow, but rather a slow, living substance that demanded patience, warmth, and the willingness to wait. And so the baker began his work in near silence. His only companions, the low creak of the wooden counter under his weight, the soft hiss of the oven's fire drawing air through its flue, and the occasional hollow thump as a lump of dough landed on the floured board, where his hands would press and turn and fold it again and again until the gluten had tightened and the surface had smoothed to a gentle sheen. And though his shop was modest, though the window glass was a little clouded and the paint on the door was beginning to peel, its reputation rested not on appearances but on the steady quality of what emerged from his oven each morning. Loaves that were dense yet tender, their crusts bronzed and fragrant. And in these pre-dawn hours he could work without interruption, the outside world held at a remove, the silence deep enough that the smallest sound seemed to hang in the air. For a moment before fading, the gentle patter of flour falling from his fingers, the faint, sharp crackle of a log settling in the fire, the whisper of a proofing cloth being drawn back from a resting loaf. And as he worked, he often thought, not of the coming day or the orders to be filled, but of the people who would break bread from these very loaves in the hours to come. The dock worker taking a thick slice before heading down to the river, the seamstress folding a heel of bread into a piece of cloth to carry with her for the midday meal, the small children who would come to the shop hand in hand with their mother, their eyes wide and eager as they peered over the counter at the warm roes cooling on the wooden racks. And perhaps this was the quiet reward of his labor, to know that something he shaped in the stillness of the night would bring warmth and sustenance to others in the busy brightness of day. And so, in the flickering glow of the oil lamp, he kept to his work, sliding one tray from the oven and replacing it with another, checking the rise of the loaves by the way they pushed back gently under his fingers, adjusting the damp cloths to prevent the crusts from hardening too soon. His hands and mind in harmony with the slow, unfolding rhythm of the doux's life. And occasionally, when the fire was holding steady and the last batch was proofing, he would step to the back door, opening it just enough to let the cool night air brush against his face, bringing with it the faint sense of the sleeping city coal dust, damp, stone, and somewhere far off, the sharp tang of the river before returning to the heat and the pale clouds of flour drifting in the lamplight. And as the hours moved gently toward dawn, the street outside began to stir in subtle ways, the faint echo of footsteps on distant cobbles, the soft rattle of a milk cart wheel, a door opening somewhere up the lane. But still the shop remained close to the street, its warmth held close until the last loaves were finished. And when, at last, the first edge of sunlight began to pale the darkness at the end of the street, he would take down the shutters with a slow, steady motion, revealing the shelves lined with their golden rows, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread. And though customers would soon arrive, filling the space with the quiet murmur of morning greetings, for now there was still a brief, lingering moment in which the baker could stand in his doorway, his hands resting lightly on the frame, and watch the street awaken, knowing that his work had already been done in the quiet hours when the rest of the city slept, that his day was already full before the clock struck 7, and that tomorrow and the day after, and every day until his hands could no longer knead, he would rise again in the dark to shape the loaves that would feed his small corner of London, a task so constant and humble that it would never be written into the histories, but one that mattered deeply in the quiet, everyday fabric of life. For without such work, unseen and uncelebrated though it might be, the city would lose some small but essential part of its comfort, its sense that each day could begin with something warm, something familiar, something made by human hands in the stillness before dawn. As the sun dipped slowly toward the horizon and the final, weary light of day spread in soft, muted layers across the rooftops of Victorian London, there came a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change not marked by bells or loud proclamations, but by the quiet preparation of the city for the night ahead. And among the first heralds of this transformation was the gas lamp lighter, a solitary figure whose daily duty began only when others were finishing theirs. A man who moved at the gentle pace of dusk itself, his work timed perfectly to the slow fading of natural light. And his presence was neither hurried nor obtrusive, for he was a familiar part of the street's evening rhythm, known by sight, if not always by name, often seen in the same coat, worn shiny at the elbows, the same tall hat tilted forward against the evening breeze, and always carrying with him the long, brass-tipped pole and small satchel that marked his trade. And as he began his nightly route, the first lamps already dim shapes against the deepening sky, he worked with a steady, unbroken motion, stopping at each post to angle the pole just so, hooking the small lever or tapping the mechanism that allowed the gas to flow, and with a soft, almost polite pop, followed by a faint hiss, the mantle inside would flare into life, at first weak and pale, then blooming into a steady, welcoming glow. And this he would repeat again and again, moving from one lamp to the next, the arc of his walk carrying him through narrow alleys, past rows of tall, soot-darkened buildings, whose upper windows caught the last of the day's glow, across small squares where children were being called indoors by voices from upstairs windows, and along busier thoroughfares, where the sound of carriage wheels echoed sharply against the stone fronts of shops closing for the night. And, though his task was simple in principle, there was a certain care to it, a small ritual he followed, with each lamp pausing just long enough to be sure the flame had caught and was drawing the gas evenly, sometimes shielding it for a moment with the curve of his hand against a sudden gust of wind. For in this time before electric light, the gas lamps were not merely a matter of convenience, but a reassurance, their pale amber circles of light pushing back the edges of the dark, allowing those still abroad to walk with greater ease. And though the lamps did not dispel all the shadows indeed, between their pools of glow lay long stretches of soft, shifting gloom that gave the streets a certain order and safety, a sense that the city had not simply surrendered to night. And as he moved through his route, the lamplighter observed small details that others often overlooked. The faint glimmer of moisture gathering along the railings as the evening cooled, the way a cat's eyes caught the lamplight before it slipped silently into an alley, the flutter of a curtain as someone peered out to see if the lamps were yet lit. And sometimes he would exchange a quiet word with the shopkeeper locking up for the night, or nod to a constable beginning his patrol. But often he walked in companionable solitude, accompanied only by the steady rhythm of his footsteps and the repeated, familiar action of lighting, a movement as ingrained in his muscles as breathing. And though his work was rarely dramatic, there was a deep satisfaction in seeing the line of his progress, a trail of warm circles stretching behind him into the distance, like breadcrumbs for the city's night travelers. And occasionally he would glance upward at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear between wisps of smoke drifting from the chimneys, and he knew that by the time he had finished his route, the city would be fully transformed, the last traces of daylight replaced by a world of shadow and flame, the air cooler, the streets quieter except for the occasional rattle of wheels or the distant echo of a closing door. And in that transformed world, his lamps would stand as quiet sentinels, their light swaying slightly in the night air. And later, when most of the city was asleep, he would walk the route again in reverse, this time extinguishing each lamp in turn, drawing down the flame with the same care he had used to bring it to life, until once again the streets lay in darkness awaiting this first light of day. And though such work was humble and often unseen, it held a certain poetry, for the lamplighter was in his way a keeper of thresholds, one of the few who marked each day's passing, not by the clock, but by the slow changing of light. And so, each evening, as London shifted gently from day to night, he walked at the city's pulse, not rushing, not lingering, but keeping perfect pace with the falling dusk, until the last lamp was lit, and the night could truly begin, as the gas lamps along the streets flickered gently in the cooling night air, casting pools of amber light that stretched and broke unevenly over the worn cobblestones. Another world stirred quietly along the banks of the River Thames, a world that belonged not to the broad daylight bustle of London, but to its slower, more measured nocturnal self. For as the day's noise faded into the soft murmur of the evening, the river took on a different voice, one that was steady yet subdued, carrying the faint lap of water against stone embankments, the occasional hollow knock of a moored boat shifting with the current, and the distant, muffled shouts of men working along the wharves, their words blurred into near indistinction by the vast, open space of water and air. In the Thames itself, that broad ribbon of movement winding through the city's heart was at night a place of contrasts, for while the water was dark and almost opaque in the absence of direct sunlight, its surface caught and scattered the light from bridges, from warehouse windows, from the lamps strung along docks and walkways, breaking them into long, trembling paths of gold and silver that swayed with the slightest movement of the current. And there was a certain stillness to the scene, despite these motions, a sense that time had slowed to match the unhurried pace of the tide, and walking along the embankment, one might pass figures moving deliberately in the half-light, men in heavy coats hauling crates from river barges to waiting carts, their boots thudding on the planks of the dock, a pair of fishermen leaning against the rail with their lines trailing in the dark water, their conversation low and unbroken, or a solitary watchman standing with his hands behind his back, scanning the shadows from movement with the unblinking patience of one long accustomed to quiet nights. And beyond these human presences, there were the smells and sensations that marked the river's night character, the faint tang of tar from the moored ships, the sharper salt edge that rode in with the tide, the earthy scent of wet stone and timber, all blending together in a way that was neither unpleasant nor particularly strong, but simply constant, part of the river's identity. And overhead, the city's haze softened the stars but did not erase them entirely, a handful of brighter ones managing to pierce the mist and twinkle faintly, reflected in small, trembling fragments on the rippling water, and from time to time a larger vessel would pass, its low, steady engine churning the water into a brighter froth, the soft wake fanning out toward the shore, where it lapped gently against the stone steps leading down to the river. Those same steps, worn smooth and shallow by countless tides and countless feet over decades, perhaps centuries, and here and there the faint creak of mooring ropes could be heard, the fibers tightening and relaxing with the rhythm of the water's movement. And if one paused and leaned against the railing, letting the cool night air rest on the face and hands, there was the strange sensation that the city itself seemed to retreat slightly from the riverbank at night, the towering warehouses, the tall, narrow houses, and the rows of shops all set back in the dark, while the river claimed its own space, its own voice. And though the Thames had long been the artery of London's commerce and industry, carrying goods in and out by the ton, at night it was something else entirely, a slow-moving mirror for the city's lights, a shifting boundary between the waking and sleeping halves of London. And as the hours moved deeper into the night, the activity along its edges slowed further still. The cartwheels grew fewer, the calls of the dock workers ceased, and the only motion came from the slow passage of the current and the occasional dark silhouette of a small boat slipping past with barely a sound. And in those moments, it was possible to imagine the river as it had been in centuries past, before the endless press of people and goods. Before the bridges spanned it so thickly, when its banks were edged with open land, and the city was little more than a cluster of lights at its edge. And perhaps that was part of the Thames's enduring presence. Sid carried the memory of the old London within it, beneath its changing face, beneath the layers of docks and embankments and industry, and those who walked beside it at night, keeping company with its slow, dark water and its glimmering paths of reflected light, might feel some faint connection to that older, quieter world. Carried on the cool wind that swept along its length, a wind that rustled the edges of coats and scarves, and reminded those still awake that here, in the steady breathing of the river, the city's heartbeat could still be heard, in the soft, misted mornings of Victorian London, before the streets had yet fully awakened to the clang and chatter of the day. The horse-drawn omnibus was already a familiar and reassuring presence, its large, boxy form rolling steadily over the uneven cobblestones, the dull thud of its heavy wheels mingling with the rhythmic clop of hooves as a pair. Sometimes a team of 3 sturdy horses pulled the long wooden carriage through the damp air, and though the omnibus was, in its essence, simply a means of getting from one place to another, it was also a small, moving fragment of London life, gathering together people of all sorts within its close wooden frame and carrying them side by side through the winding, dusty, and often crowded streets. And in the quieter hours, one could hear the smaller details of its journey. The soft, metallic jingle of harness fittings, shifting with each step of the horses. The occasional creak of the wooden frame as it leaned gently into a turn. The driver's low, steady voice calling to his horses, or offering a brief greeting to a fellow driver passing in the opposite direction. And stepping aboard was an act both simple and deliberate, for one approached the omnibus as it paused by the roadside, mounted the narrow step, and settled onto a bench seat that ran along the length of the interior, each seat polished smooth by countless coats and dresses sliding across its surface over the years. And once seated, there was a peculiar intimacy to the ride, for the passengers, whether they knew one another or not, shared a confined space, their knees sometimes nearly touching the sway of the carriage, moving them all together in unison. And though conversation was not always common, when it did arise, it was often polite and restrained, caped by the manners of the day and exchange about the weather, a comment on the state of the roads, perhaps a remark about the day's errands. And outside, the city slipped past in a kind of slow, continuous scroll, with shop fronts, iron railings, street vendors, and the ever-present haze drifting in the morning air. And for those seated on the upper deck, reached by a narrow, winding staircase at the rear, the view was broader still, with chimney-tops, hanging signs, and the greater sweep of the road ahead visible over the heads of the horses, their manes lifting slightly in the breeze as they pulled on without pause. And the motion of the omnibus was steady, but never hurried, for its pace was the natural pace of the animals themselves, unchanging whether it moved through a quiet street, where the only other sound was the distant bark of a dog, or along a busier thoroughfare where carts, carriages, canned pedestrians intermingled in a constant flow. And it was in this steady pace that the omnibus found its rhythm, one that passengers came to rely upon, dependable, predictable, almost soothing in its repetition. And yet, the journey was not without its smaller challenges, for the streets of London were rarely smooth, and the carriage often rocked gently from side to side, a reminder of the uneven cobbles beneath, while on wet days the wheels splashed through shallow puddles, sending up small arcs of muddy water to darken the lower panels of the omnibus. And the horses themselves, though tireless in their work, were living creatures with their own moods and needs, and drivers knew to read the tilt of their heads, the twitch of an ear, the subtle change in gait that might mean a stone in the hoof or a moment's fatigue, okay? And so, from time to time, the omnibus would pull aside, the driver stepping down to check the tach, patting a neck with quiet familiarity before resuming the journey. And inside, passengers shifted slightly on their benches, adjusting hats or gloves, glancing out of the small, glass-paned windows to see the delay. And as the day went on, the light inside the omnibus changed, the pale silver of morning giving way to the warmer, more golden hue of the afternoon, the shafts of sunlight angling through the windows and catching in the dust that hung faintly in the air, stirred by every movement. And it was in these moments, swaying gently with the slow progress of the carriage, that one could sense how deeply woven into the fabric of daily life the omnibus had become. For it was not a novelty or a rare treat, but a humble constant, a reliable link between the scattered parts of the city, from the busy markets to the quieter residential lanes. And in the evenings, when the day's errands were done, it carried workers home, its lanterns casting a soft, circular glow into the darkening streets. The sound of the horses' hooves, a little slower now, the driver's shoulders, a little more hunched against the cool air, and passengers, weary from the day, sat in reflective silence, the creak of the wood and the faint, steady snort of the horses marking the time between stops. And so it was, day after day, year after year, that the horse-drawn omnibus served its city, its pace never quickened by impatience, its course never altered by fashion, moving always at the speed of the hooves that drew it, carrying its human cargo through rain and fog, through the dust of summer and the frost of winter, till it became, in the quiet, enduring way of such things, familiar thread woven through the daily tapestry of Victorian London, not remembered for any single dramatic moment, but for the countless, unremarkable journeys that together formed the heartbeat of a city in motion. In the deepening dusk of a Victorian evening, when the last traces of daylight faded slowly from the brick and stone facades of the city, the streets of London began their quiet transformation under the soft and steady glow of gaslight. And the change was not abrupt, but gradual, as one by one the tall, slender lamps that lined the main thoroughfares and narrower side streets flickered into life, their pale yellow flames shielded by glass lantern heads, the lamplighter moving from one post to the next with deliberate care, a long pole in hand, course to check the mechanism before drawing down the small lever that released the flow of gas. And in that brief moment, a faint hiss could be heard, followed by the gentle flare of light that quickly steadied into a calm, unwavering glow. And though the lamplighter's work was a practical necessity, it also carried with it a sense of quiet ritual, a daily performance that marked the shift from day to night. And as the line of lamps grew longer behind him, each one a small island of illumination, the city seemed to take a slow, contented breath, its sharper edges softening under the gentle light. For gaslight had a quality unlike daylight. It was warmer, softer, more forgiving, casting long, steep-edged shadows and giving the air a faint golden haze in which shapes appeared just slightly blurred, so that a figure moving in the distance seemed both present and a little removed. And the shop fronts, once plain under the afternoon sun, now seemed to take on a new life as the lamps outside sent their light across polished windows, catching on the brass handles of doors and gleaming faintly on the lettering of painted signs, while inside the warm flicker of candles or oil lamps mingled with the glow from outside, giving the interiors a layered depth of light that invited the passerby to pause and look in, perhaps even to step inside. And as the evening went on, the streets filled with a different sort of sound, the sharp cries of market sellers or the clatter of carts rushing to their destinations, the softer murmur of evening traffic, the steady beat of horses' hooves pulling private carriages or hired hansoms, the low rumble of wheels on cobblestones, the occasional burst of laughter from a group of young men heading toward an alehouse, and the rustle of long skirts as women walked home from visits or errands. their silhouettes moving gracefully through the shifting patterns of light and shadow. And in the poorer districts, the gas lamps were fewer, their glow more thinly spread, so that long stretches of street lay in near darkness between the small pools of light. And here the shadows were deeper still, moving faintly as if alive when stirred by a passing figure. And yet, even in these dimmer areas, the gaslight marked a change in the city's mood, for there was a comfort in seeing the familiar outline of a lamp ahead, a signpost in the gloom that assured one of the way forward. And the light itself, though modest by the standards of later electric brilliance, seemed, in its time, a marvel of modern improvement, far more reliable than the flickering oil lamps that had preceded it. And so it became woven into the life of the city, a part of every evening's rhythm, marking the hours as surely as the tolling of the church bells. And if one stood for a while beneath the lamp, one could see the small details of its work, the faint shimmer of heat that rose above the glass, the way tiny moths circled close to the glow, drawn in by instinct, yet kept from the flame by the glass barrier, the glint of moisture on the iron post after a light rain, and the slight crackle in the still air when the gas burned a little stronger in a sudden breeze. And beyond the lamps themselves, the streets, under their care, took on a particular kind of life, for couples strolled arm in arm, their shadows stretching long across the paving stones. Small knots of workers paused to talk before heading to lodgings. The shopkeepers, who stayed open after dark, stood in their doorways, framed by light on one side and darkness on the other. And the cab drivers waited at corners where the lamps were brightest, knowing a well-lit spot meant a better chance of being hailed, and all the while the gaslight seemed to soften the harshness of the day, blurring the dirt and wear of the city into something gentler, more picturesque, even if the reality remained unchanged. And in the grander districts, where the lamps stood closer together and the glass was kept cleaner, the streets took on a certain elegance, the soft glow reflecting from polished carriage sides and catching on the fine fabrics of evening gowns as the wealthy made their way to dinner parties or the theater. Their conversations low and measured, their movements unhurried beneath the reassuring glow, while in contrast, in the busy entertainment districts, the gaslight was bright enough to compete with the glare from music halls and public houses, their bold painted signs lit from within or by clusters of lamps, spilling light onto the pavement where crowds gathered to watch street performers or to greet friends. And here the air was filled with a mix of scents, the smoke from the lamps, mingling with roasting chestnuts sold by street vendors, the sharp tang of horse sweat from the cab ranks, and the occasional drift of perfume as a lady passed by, and above it all, faint but ever present, the smell of the gas itself, a reminder of the mechanism behind the magic, not unpleasant, but distinct enough to be noticed when one paused close to a lamppost, and if the night turned colder, as it often did, the light seemed to take on an added value, its glow offering the illusion of warmth, even if the air remained crisp. And the lamplighter, having finished his route, would retrace his steps home, the ladder on his back or the long pole in his hand, his work done until the hour came to dim the lights again before dawn, for unlike the sun, the gas lamps did not fade gradually. With the morning they were put out in their turn, one by one, until the last faint flame was gone and the city returned to daylight. Yet, in the hours they burned, they shaped the character of the streets entirely, turning the familiar into something softer, more mysterious, sometimes even romantic. And it was under gaslight that many a quiet conversation was had, many a hurried step was quickened, many a meeting was arranged or delayed, and for all its practical purpose, the glow of the gas lamp became a backdrop to countless small stories, each one briefly illuminated before passing again into shadow. And so it was that the gaslit streets belonged as much to memory as to the moment, for anyone who walked them often enough could recall the way the light fell on a certain corner, the way a shadow stretched across the cobbles, the faint hiss and flicker of the flame on a windy night. And in those recollections, the city seemed both larger and smaller, a place of endless turning streets, and yet of familiar paths marked by the steady light of the lamps, guiding the way home. It was in the heart of winter that the city seemed to draw itself inward, as though the cold and the damp conspired to press the streets closer together. The tall buildings leaning just a fraction nearer under the weight of their own frost, and the air was thick with a gray mist that clung to the skin and dampened the breath. But on certain days, the mist would deepen into the kind of fog that Londoners knew too well, the sort that rose from the river in slow, curling folds and spread itself through every alley and across every square until the world beyond a few yards was swallowed whole. And on such days, the city moved in a strange half-silence, as though sound itself were muffled by the heavy air, so that the clop of hooves on cobblestones seemed to come from nowhere and go nowhere, fading almost as soon as it was heard. And the cry of a newspaper boy at the corner was less a call than a shadow of one lost in the dense haze before it could carry far. And the fog was not merely a curtain between the eye and the world, but a thing in itself, almost tangible, a slow-moving presence that curled around lampposts and drifted in at open doorways, sliding along the floor until it vanished into the dim recesses of a shop. And those who walked the streets in such weather moved with more caution, their eyes straining for shapes ahead, their ears pricked for footsteps behind, for the familiar was rendered strange in the white-gray blur, and a corner one had turned 100 times before might appear suddenly unfamiliar, its angles smoothed by the fog, the outlines of doors and windows barely there, so that one could almost believe the city itself was shifting in the mist, rearranging its streets like pieces on a board. And though the gas lamps still burned, their light was caught in the thickness of the air, reduced to faint, hazy spheres that glowed without truly piercing the gloom, giving each lamp a halo of pale gold that hovered in place, bright enough to mark a point in the darkness, but not enough to show clearly what lay beyond. And this lent the streets an air of uncertainty, for one might see a figure emerge from the edge of that glow and pass close by without ever knowing, their face only the brush of a sleeve or the echo of footsteps to mark their presence, and the fog, being cold as well as damp, seemed to soak into clothing and bone alike, so that even the best-kept overcoat felt heavy and the warmth of a scarf or muffler gave little comfort. And it was in such weather that the city's pace slowed, for the hansom cabs and omnibuses could not rush without risk, their drivers peering into the murk ahead, reins held tight, while the horse's breath came out in clouds that mingled with the fog until animal and air were indistinguishable. And yet, despite the inconvenience, there was something in this winter fog that gave the streets a certain quiet dignity, a sense of patience, as though the city were content to wait within its gray shroud, and those who knew it well walked with a kind of trust, confident that the familiar shapes were still there beneath the veil. And for the observer who took the time to stand and watch, there were small moments of beauty, a lamp's halo turning the drifting mist into molten gold, the way the fog swirled and parted briefly around a passing figure, the delicate beads of moisture on a wrought iron gate, or the faint reflection of a lamp's glow in a puddle at the edge of the road. And as the hours passed, the fog shifted in depth and tone, sometimes thinning enough to show the faint outlines of rooftops, sometimes thickening until even the lamp posts became ghostly shadows. And it was in these hours that the city's quieter trades carried on in near silence, the print shops still turning out their broadsheets in dimly lit rooms, the bakers shaping their dough by the glow of their ovens, the sweepers pushing brooms along the pavements in slow arcs, their outlines blurring into the gray until they seemed more like shapes of the fog itself than men at work. And from time to time the sound of a bell would rise from the river, a hollow, echoing note that seemed both near and far, the fog bending and carrying the sound in ways that made its source hard to guess, and those on the river felt the same uncertainty, for the barges and ferries moved with extreme care, their pilots calling out to one another in short, sharp bursts. The voices dulled but still urgent in the heavy air, and yet, for all its challenges, the fog was also a cloak for the city, hiding its imperfections, softening its hard edges, lending even the roughest street an air of mystery. And there were those who loved it for this reason, who found in its concealment a sense of privacy, a chance to disappear into the world's folds for a while, to walk unseen and unremarked. And perhaps this was why. In the poorer districts, where the fog was thickest and the lamps fewer, there was still a steady flow of movement, men slipping into public houses without drawing attention, women crossing from one doorway to another, children darting out to fetch bread or coal and vanishing again into the haze. And as the day wore on, the fog might lift just enough for a glimpse of the pale winter sun, light a cold silver disk behind the thinning mist, and the sight of it brought a subtle change in mood, a slight quickening of pace as the possibility of clearer air seemed near. Yet often the reprieve was short, the fog rolling back in with the shifting of the wind, as though the city itself had decided that the day's face would remain hidden. And in the evening, when the lamps were lit, their halos appeared brighter against the dense air, making each small pool of light a destination in itself, and those moving through the streets aimed for the next glow, as if crossing a chain of islands in a dark sea, at each pool of light revealing its share of shapes, faces half glimpsed, a carriage door swinging shut, the glint of coins exchanged before the figures vanished again into the pale blur. And in such weather the night felt longer, the hours stretching out under the dim glow. And when at last the fog began to thin toward dawn, it left behind a city damp to its core, the stones slick, the air heavy, and the colors muted, as though even in retreat the fog's hand still rested on the place, and the people, waking too, clearer streets carried with them the memory of having lived inside the world's own breath for a day, where everything was close yet distant, familiar yet strange, and where the gas lamps had seemed less like mere devices and more like beacons in a boundless gray. There are mornings when the city wakes, not to the quiet drip of rain or the soft pad of footsteps on damp stone, too, but to the clang and rumble of iron in motion, sound that begins before the sun has properly risen, carried through the cold air, in sharp, ringing notes that seem to vibrate against the very buildings themselves. For this is the hour when the great machinery of the railway, the tram lines, the workshops, and the shipyards begins to stir, when men with blackened hands and soot-smudged faces are already at their posts, feeding coal into fireboxes, tightening bolts, swinging hammers, with a rhythm that is as much a part of the city's pulse as the toll of church bells. And in these hours, the air seems alive with the interplay of metal upon metal, the hiss of steam from a venting boiler, the deep groan of a turning wheel, the metallic cough of an engine starting its day. And this symphony of industry is not confined to one district alone, for from the rail yards in the east to the forges in the south, a prides along the river to the great foundries beyond the old walls, the city hums and shudders under the work of iron, the sound of progress and necessity blending into a single, ceaseless note. And yet, for all its force, the sound does not drown the life around it, but merges with it, so that a street vendor's call for fresh rolls can be heard cutting neatly across the hiss of steam, or the sharp whistle of a foreman rises above the steady thud of hammer on anvil. And here, where the work is hardest, there is an unspoken language in the sounds themselves, for the ring of a struck rail, the squeal of a tightened screw, the brief hiss as water meets molten metal, these are not random noises, but signals, understood by the men who hear them, each telling its own story of a task completed, a job begun, or a danger narrowly avoided. And to an outsider, the din may seem relentless, even overwhelming, but to those born to it, it is as natural as birdsong, for they know the timbre of every note, when a machine is running true and when a bearing is wearing thin. When a hammer stroke has found its mark, and when it is glanced aside, and they move in time with these sounds, there are muscles anticipating the rhythm before the ear has caught it, so that a line of riveters might work with the precision of a drum course. Each blow timed to land just after the hiss of the steam hammer. Cues, each pause aligned to the moment the iron cools enough to take the next strike. And in such moments, the city is less a collection of buildings than a living mechanism, each part moving in concert with the others. The streets serving as arteries for carts laden with fresh steel or stacks of timber. The cranes swinging overhead like the arms of some colossal machine, and the air itself thick with the tang of metal and coal. And yet, for all the grit and heat of the work, there is beauty in the order of it, in the way a length of raw iron emerges from the forge as a gleaming rail, in the way a pile of bolts and plates becomes a frame, in the way the rhythmic pounding echoes between the brick walls of the yard, carrying a strange, almost musical quality when heard from just far enough away. And there are boys who linger at the edges of these places, watching with wide eyes as the sparks fly in golden arcs, each flare lighting up the soot-streaked faces of the men who hardly notice them, their minds fixed on the work, their hands moving with practiced certainty. And in time, those boys will take their place at the hammers and lathes, adding their own muscle to the great iron heartbeat of the city, and the cycle will continue, as it has for decades, for the city's hunger for iron is never sated, its appetite growing with every new length of track, every new engine, every ship sliding down the slipway into the waiting river. And it is not only the great works that feed this hunger, but the smaller shops and smithies, tucked into narrow lanes or behind plain wooden doors, where one man might labor over a single piece for hours, shaping it to fit a lock or a hinge, mending a fractured tool, or fashioning a length of chain for a merchant's cart. And in these quieter places, the sound of iron is different, not the roar of the foundry or the clatter of the rail yard, but the steady, patient tap of a smaller hammer, the rasp of a file, the occasional sizzle as a heated piece meets the cooling water in the quenched tub. And even here, the air is tinged with the same scent of worked metal, the faint, acrid sweetness of oil, the dry heat of the forge, the metallic taste that seems to linger on the tongue after an hour in such a place. And when the day is done, and the great engines wind down, and the last of the carts rumbles off with its load, there remains an echo of the day's labor in the still air, a faint hum in the bones of the buildings, as though the work has left its mark, not only in the rails and beams, but in the very stones of the city. And those who walk home through the quiet streets feel it in their own bodies too, the weight of hours bent over the anvil or standing at the press, the dull ache in the arms and shoulders that speaks of honest labor. And perhaps it is this that makes the sound of iron something more than mere noise, for it is both the voice of the city's making and the measure of its people's endurance, a reminder that behind every rail and rivet lies the breath and strength of those who shaped it. And as the lamps are lit and the streets grow dark, and the only sound is the distant, fading clank of a late wagon's wheels, there is a satisfaction in knowing that tomorrow, before the sun has risen, the sound of iron will return, as steady and sure as the turning of the world. There is a certain kind of road that does not simply connect to places, but seems instead to stretch into the very idea of distance itself. A road that begins in the familiar hum of the city, between tall buildings whose windows reflect the light of the morning sun, and then, slowly, almost without you noticing, carries you away from the clatter and bustle into something quieter, where the cobblestones give way to packed earth and the scent of smoke and bread is replaced by the sharper, cleaner air of open land. And on such a road, The hours take on a different weight, for they are measured not by the clock, but by the changing of the light, the lengthening of shadows, the way the sun shifts from a pale yellow to a deeper, more golden hue as it slides toward the horizon. And as you walk or ride along it, the road itself seems to breathe, narrowing as it winds between old hedgerows, widening into gentle slopes where the grass spills over its edges, dipping into shallow valleys where the air is cool and damp, then climbing again into stretches where the wind has a long run and comes at you with the smell of distant rain. And the sound of your own passage becomes a companion. The steady crunch of your boots or the muted clop of a horse's hooves, keeping time with the rhythm of your breath, while somewhere far off a lark calls and then falls silent, as if watching you pass. And you begin to notice the little details that a hurried traveler would miss, the way a low branch has grown to brush the road as if in greeting, the faint track of a fox that crossed in the night, the worn stone at a bend where countless wheels have graced it over the years, each mark a whisper from someone long gone. And it is in these details that the road's history hides, not in monuments or markers, but in the simple fact that it has been used, day after day, year after year, by farmers bringing their produce to market, by messengers carrying news both joyful and grim, by lovers walking together at dusk, their voices hushed in the quiet air, and by soldiers whose boots struck the ground in a harsher rhythm, each step a reminder of duty rather than choice. And though the road itself does not speak, it seems to remember, holding within its ruts and curves the memory of all who have passed this way, so that in certain places, when the wind stills and the light falls just so, you feel not alone, but accompanied by the echo of countless journeys. And this sensation grows stronger the further you go, until the thought of turning back feels strange, as if the road itself has drawn you onward and will not easily release you. And there are moments when the land around you seems to open in a way that is almost theatrical, the hedges parting to reveal a sudden expanse of fields, the road curving to lead you along a ridge where you can see miles of countryside unrolling like a green and gold tapestry, dotted with farmhouses and copses of trees, the river winding through it all like a silver thread. And in such moments, you might think the road generous, offering you this view as a kind of gift. But it is just as quick to close in again, drawing you between walls of rock or deep banks where the light grows dim and the air carries the damp smell of moss. And here your footsteps sound louder, your breath more present in your ears, until once again it eases and lets you out into the open. So it goes, mile after mile, a quiet conversation between enclosure and release, between the known and the unknown. And the further you travel, the more you sense that this road is less about reaching a destination than about the act of traveling itself. For even when a village appears ahead, its rooftops clustered around a church spire, you do not quicken your pace, knowing that once you pass through it, the road will simply lead you onward again, past gardens and fields, past orchards heavy with fruit or bare with winter's rest, past streams that run laughing under little stone bridges, until the village is behind you and you are once again in the company of the road alone. And perhaps it is in this way that such a road works its slow magic, stripping away the distractions that usually crowd the mind, leaving you with nothing but the steady progress of your own movement, the shifting sky above and the endless line of the path before you. And though it may seem that you are going somewhere, you begin to realize that you are also, in a strange way, staying still. For the road is as much within you as it is beneath your feet, its length measured not just in miles, but in the space it opens in your thoughts. And it is this space that makes the journey feel different from all others, because here there is no urgency, no pressing need to arrive. Only the quiet compulsion to continue, to see what lies beyond the next rise, the next bend, the next stretch of shadowed trees. And when you do, pause perhaps at a place where a spring spills into a stone basin, or at the crest of a hill where the wind presses cool fingers against your face. You feel less like a traveler taking a break than like a part of the road itself, pausing in its own long story. And as the day draws toward its close, and the light begins to thin into the gray blue of evening, the road changes once more, the colors around it softening, the hedges seeming taller, the distances shorter, the air carrying the faint smoke of distant hearts. And you know that somewhere ahead there will be an inn or a farmhouse where you might rest. But you also know that this road will not end there, for tomorrow it will stretch onward through the waking fields, into the heart of the next day, into the turning of the seasons, into the lives of those yet to walk it, and perhaps into places you cannot yet imagine. And in that thought lies the quiet truth of the endless road, that it does not belong to you, but you belong to it. For as long as you are on it, you are part of its unbroken line, a single step in its long memory, and when you leave it, it will go on without you, carrying others forward just as it carried those before. And perhaps one day, when you find yourself on another road, in another place, you will hear in the sound of your own footsteps the faint, familiar echo of this one, and you will know that in some way you are still walking it. There is a harbor that does not appear on most maps, a place spoken of in low voices by those who once stumbled upon it and never entirely forgot. Not because of its grandeur or its beauty in the usual sense, but because it carries the strange weight of time itself, as though it has been quietly existing outside the turning of the world. And reaching it is not a matter of following a marked route, but of letting yourself be guided by a sequence of unremarkable choices that somehow lead you there. Turning down a narrow road simply because the light on the stones seemed different, or pausing at a crossroads until the wind nudged you one way rather than another, and eventually finding yourself on a track that winds down toward the sea through scrub and wildflowers, the air heavy with the mingled scents of salt and earth, until the track becomes a set of worn steps cut into the cliffside, each step uneven, the stone smoothed by the passage of countless feet long gone. And as you descend, the sound of the sea grows from a distant hush to a deep, unbroken breath, until you round a curve and the harbor opens before you, a quiet bowl of water sheltered by two curving arms of rock, the surface rippling faintly under the late afternoon light, and you see boats moored there, though not the kind you find in busy ports, for these are old wooden vessels, their paint faded to the color of dried kelp, their ropes frayed but neatly coiled, and it is hard to tell if they're still in use or simply waiting for someone who will never return. And along the edge of the harbor stand a handful of buildings, small and weather-worn, their walls the color of sand, their roofs sagging slightly under the weight of years, with shutters that hang a little askew, yet somehow give the impression that they are not abandoned, only resting. And there is a narrow stone pier jutting into the water, its surface mottled with lichen, and at the far end sits an elderly man in a cap, mending a net with the slow, precise motions of someone who has done this 1,000 times before. And when he looks up, there is no surprise in his gaze, as though he has been expecting you, though you have no memory of ever meeting him. And, without speaking, he nods toward the far side of the harbor, where a path leads between two low sheds. And following it, you find yourself in a little square, where the stones underfoot are polished smooth by countless tides and boots. And here there is a tavern with its door propped open, letting out the warm scent of wood smoke and fish cooking. And inside the light is dim and golden, the kind of light that makes every shadow seem friendly. And a few people seated at the tables glance up briefly, but do not stare. So travelers are not unusual here, though you cannot imagine where they might have come from. Canna, the woman behind the counter, greets you with a nod and sets before you a plate of something simple but perfectly cooked. And as you eat, you notice that the conversations around you are quiet, their words half swallowed by the thick air, as if even speech must be softened in this place, so as not to disturb whatever keeps it intact. And after you finish stepping outside again, you find that the light has shifted. The sun now low enough to paint the water in deep gold and crimson, the surface broken by the slow movement of the tide. And as you walk along the shore, you see that the harbor walls are not made of cut stone, but of massive natural rock, worn into strange shapes by centuries of wind and wave, some of them like crouching animals, others like the half-raised faces of giants. And there is a stillness here that is not emptiness, but a kind of patient watching, as though the place itself is aware of you, measuring you against some quiet standard. And if you stand still long enough, you might hear, beneath the soft rush of water, a deeper sound, like the slow beating of a heart. And you begin to sense that this harbor has been here far longer than the buildings, perhaps longer than the people who once first claimed it, and that it will remain long after both have gone. For it is not merely a shelter for boats, but a kind of threshold between the land and whatever lies beyond the horizon. And there are hints of this everywhere the way the tide seems to pause, as if listening, the strange glint of light deep in the water, even when the sky is overcast, the faint carvings on a boulder near the pier that do not match any alphabet, their edges softened by time until they are more suggestion than inscription, and the more you look, the more you feel the quiet pull of the unknown, the temptation to step into one of those old boats and let the tide carry you wherever it wishes, though some instinct tells you that such a choice might not easily be undone. And as evening deepens, lamps begin to glow in the windows of the few buildings, their light falling in trembling lines across the water, and the air grows cooler, carrying the scent of the open sea. And you realize that while you could find your way back up the cliff path and return to the world, there is also the possibility of staying here, at least for a while, letting the days slip past in the rhythm of the tide, watching the sky change, learning the subtle moods of the harbor, and perhaps, in time, understanding whatever it is that has kept this place apart from the rest of the world. And whether you leave or stay, you know that this harbor will remain exactly as it is, waiting for the next traveler to arrive by chance or by fate, and that the memory of it will follow you, no matter how far you go, a quiet reminder that there are places in the world that do not need to be found to exist, simply are, patient and enduring, at the edge of the map and the edge of the known. When the morning came, the harbor was wrapped in a pale mist that turned every shape into a soft outline and muffled every sound until even the gulls seemed reluctant to call, their cries fading almost before they began. And in that strange quiet, you felt the pull of the road that began at the far side of the harbor, a narrow strip of cobblestone that led away from the sea and into the low hills beyond, its surface worn by years of footsteps and cartwheels, but still intact, as though no storm had ever been able to truly claim it. And as you stepped onto it, you found the mist closing gently behind you, making the harbor vanish as though it had been only a dream. The smell of salt fading from the air, replaced by the damp green scent of the inland, where small streams crossed the road in trickles and tiny ferns grew between the stones. And the hills rose slowly, each one revealing another beyond it, its path curving in such a way that you could never quite see more than a few hundred steps ahead, which gave you the uncanny feeling that the road was revealing itself only as you chose to walk it, like a story told one word at a time. And after a while, you began to notice signs that the road had once been part of a greater route. For here and there, a moss-covered milestone appeared at the edge, its markings too worn to read, but still suggesting that someone, long ago, had measured and cared for it this way. And sometimes you would pass the remains of stone walls that now served as anchors for wild vines and flowering shrubs, their original purpose long since forgotten, yet still giving the landscape a sense of quiet structure, as if the ghosts of boundaries remained, even when the land had reclaimed them. And the further you went, the more the world seemed to fall into a kind of rhythm. Your footsteps and the whisper of wind in the grass forming a soft, steady pulse that lulled your thoughts into drifting, until you almost did not notice when the road crested a rise, and you saw ahead a valley unlike any you had passed before, broad and green and dotted with patches of dark forest, and in its center lay what looked like the ruins of a town, though from this distance it was hard to tell whether it was truly abandoned or simply very still. So you descended, the air warming as you went, the smell of earth deepening, and as you drew closer, the shapes of the buildings became clearer. Low structures, made of pale stone, their roofs either gone or sunken, their windows open to the air, and the streets between them overgrown with grass and flowers. But there was something strangely careful about the ruin, though it had not been destroyed by violence or neglect, but simply set aside. Like a book left open on a table, its story paused mid-sentence, and when you stepped into the first of the streets, you felt an almost physical pressure, not threatening, but present, like the air just before a storm. And you realized that there were carvings on the walls, not decorative flourishes, but symbols, some spirals, some interlocking lines, and others that resembled constellations, though none you recognized, and you traced your hand along one of them, feeling the shallow grooves, the edges worn smooth, and wondered whether they were meant to be read, or whether they were not words at all, but markers of something older than language. And as you moved deeper into the town, you began to hear a sound, faint at first, like water dripping into a deep cistern, and following it, led you to a square at the very center where a circular stone structure stood, its open mouth leading down into darkness, and the sound of water echoed up from within, steady and slow. And leaning over the edge, you could see only a faint shimmer far below, yet the air that rose from it was cool and carried a scent you could not quite name, something metallic and clean, and you had the impression that whatever fed that well was not an ordinary spring, though whether that was comforting or unsettling, you could not decide. And near the well there was a single bench, its wood darkened with age, but still solid, as though waiting for someone to return and sit there. And you found yourself wondering who had built all this, and why they had left, and whether they had meant to return. And it occurred to you that the road you were on might be part of a network, a hidden thread that connected the harbor to this valley, and perhaps to other places that had been forgotten or hidden, places that still existed quietly beyond the notice of the world. And as that thought settled in, you felt a subtle shift in the air, as though the valley itself had acknowledged you, and you realized that the sun had climbed high, the mist from the morning long burned away, and that the road continued on, leaving the valley by a narrow pass on its far side, and you knew you could linger here, exploring every corner, tracing the carvings until you learned their shapes by heart. But the pull of the road was still with you, quiet but insistent. And so, after one last look at the well, you found the pass and began the slow climb, the path narrowing until the stone walls on either side rose higher than your head, their surfaces damp and veined with moss, the air cooler in the shade. And at the highest point you stopped, for beyond lay a sight so unexpected that it rooted you in place, vast plain stretching to the horizon, its surface broken by the silver lines of rivers, and in the far distance, faint but unmistakable, the glint of towers, tall and slender, rising into the pale blue sky. And though they were too far away to make out clearly, their very presence carried a weight, as if they belonged to an age older than the one you knew. And you realized that the road you were on was leading you there, not directly, perhaps, but inevitably. And with that realization came a quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead would change you, whether you wished it or not. And so you began the long descent, the air warming again, the sounds of birds returning, and the grass along the roadside rippling in waves as the wind moved across it. And for a while, you simply walked, letting the vastness of the plain settle in your mind, until you began to notice other signs, the faint remains of another wall here, the suggestion of an ancient bridge there, all hinting that this was once a land crossed and lived in, and perhaps, like the harbor and the valley, it had simply slipped from the world's memory, left to be found only by those who followed the road without demanding to know where it ended. Hey, and as evening came on, you saw a small cluster of lights in the distance, flickering warmly in the growing dark. And though you could not yet see the shapes of the buildings, you felt that same sense of quiet welcome you had known before. And you understood that this journey was not about reaching the towers quickly, but about passing through the places along the way, each one offering its own piece of a story you had not yet learned how to read, but which you knew with a certainty as steady as the road beneath your feet you would one day understand. The plain stretched before you for days, each sunrise bringing with it the same wide expanse of grass and river and sky, and each evening closing with the same quiet blaze of orange sinking behind the far horizon. Yet the towers in the distance never felt any less impossible, always standing there as if they had been waiting for centuries, their silver glint catching the light at dawn and holding it through the day. And as you walked the road, you began to notice that it had subtly changed. The cobblestones more regular now, less weathered, the moss between them thinner, as though you were nearing a place that had not been left entirely to time. And the air itself carried a different quality, cleaner and cooler, touched with a faint scent of stone and rain, even when the sky was clear, and after so many days in the open. So the first sign of change came when the road dipped into a shallow valley, and the grass gave way. Two small clusters of pale-leaved trees, their branches whispering in a breeze like a language you could almost understand. Hey, and beneath them ran streams so clear you could see the tiny silver fish darting between smooth stones. And here and there you found small arches of carved stone, standing alone among the trees, their purpose unclear, neither gates nor bridges, yet each one perfectly shaped, their surfaces etched with the same spirals and constellations you had seen in the forgotten valley far behind you. And you began to feel that these symbols were not random, that they were part of a pattern that extended across all the hidden places the road had led you through. And as you climbed out of the valley, the towers seemed suddenly closer. No longer hazy outlines, but distinct forms, each rising impossibly high, their surfaces not smooth as they had appeared from afar, but covered in patterns of silver and dark stone, catching the sunlight in shifting ways so that they seemed almost to breathe. And the road straightened now, running like a drawn line toward them. And in the distance, you began to see movement, tiny shapes crossing the land between you and the towers, though whether they were people, animals, or something else entirely you could not tell. And the wind carried faint sound spells perhaps, or chimes so delicate that you could not be sure whether they came from the towers themselves or from somewhere hidden among the fields. And as the day deepened into afternoon, the towers rose higher and higher in your view until they seemed to lean toward you, their presence filling the sky. And at last, just as the first stars began to appear, you reached the outer edge of a great stone causeway, its surface smooth and pale, lined on either side with tall lamps of green metal that glowed with a steady light. And the causeway led straight toward the largest of the towers, which stood at the center of a wide, circular plaza that seemed to hum faintly under your feet, as if the stone itself were alive with some slow, deep rhythm. And around the base of the tower were smaller structures, graceful and curved, their windows open to the air. And here you saw people at last, though they moved quietly, dressed in simple garments of gray and white. And each one who passed, you inclined their head in greeting, their eyes warm but unreadable, and you felt no need to speak. For there was a peace in this place that required no explanation, and when you stepped into the plaza, you realized that The hum you felt was accompanied by a low tone, not quite music, but something that resonated within you as if it had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. And the great doors of the tower stood open, not guarded, but simply present, their height so great that you felt small before them. And when you entered, the air was cool and filled with a pale light that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. And the floor was made of the same spiraled stone you had seen on your journey. But here the patterns were vast and intricate, flowing into each other like rivers. And at the center of the hall there was a pool of still water. It's perfectly round, its surface reflecting not the ceiling above, but a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. And as you approached, the sound of the bells returned, clearer now, each tone falling like a drop into the quiet, and you felt that this was not the end of the road, or rather the point where all roads met, where the harbor and the valley and the plains all became part of a single whole. And in that moment you understood that the journey had never been about reaching the towers for their own sake, but about carrying with you every place you had passed, every step you had taken, so that when you arrived here, you arrived not as a traveler seeking something new, but as someone bringing the entire path with them. In standing there, you felt the presence of the ones who had walked before you, not as ghosts, but as echoes, their steps woven into yours. And you knew that others would come after, following the same road in their own time, and they too would find the harbor, the valley, the plains, a causeway, and the towers, each in their own way, and perhaps they would add something to it, a new carving, a new story, a new turn in the road. And you felt no sadness at the thought of leaving, for the road was not going to simply curve onward in a way you could not yet see. And in that knowledge, there was a deep rest, the kind that comes only when the journey has been both long and true. And as you turned from the pool and stepped back into the plaza, the night had fully come, the lamps casting soft circles of light, the stars overhead brighter than you had ever seen them, and somewhere far off a breeze carried the scent of the sea, as if reminding you of where it had all begun. And you walked to the edge of the causeway, looking out over the plain, the silver lines of the rivers glinting under the moon. And you felt a quiet gratitude for every mile, every turn, every shadow, and every light, for the road itself, for the places it had led you, and for the fact that it would always be there, stretching beyond the horizon, waiting for whoever was ready to follow it. And in that stillness, in that peace, you closed your eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the towers and the night settle around you. And when you opened them again, you took a slow breath, knowing that for now, the journey was at rest. And so, to all who have walked with me in thought and in heart, I wish you peace, I wish you rest, I wish you dreams filled with wide roads and open skies. And for tonight, simply, good night.